Alrighty, path, week 5, acid-base balance and blood. Alright, so an acid is going to be any substance that releases a hydrogen ion, and as we increase the acid concentrations in our body, this produces a decrease in pH. And inversely, a base is any substance that accepts a hydrogen ion in solution, and as we have an increase in base, this produces an increase in pH. So over here we've got our pH scale, a pH of 14, this is on the very base side, a pH of 0, this is on the very acidic side. We are naturally at about 7.35, 7.45 in our body in the ECF. And then as you can see, as we become more, as we urinate, urine is naturally more acidic. Gastric acid is very acidic. And then we have, Okay, so when we have alterations to pH, we're going to end up having dysfunctions to our cell functions. We normally only have very low levels of hydrogen ions in our body, but they are so powerful, they are such a strong acid that every little bit of alteration to hydrogen ion concentrations can make profound impacts to our acidity or alkalinity. And then we can have severe impairment or death if we have a pH that is under 6.9 or above 7.8. Normal is going to be 7.35 to 7.45. And a little bit of this kind of helps me understand pH a little bit better. The P in pH stands for, implies that it is a negative logarithm. And the H just stands for hydrogen. So we are measuring the negative logarithm of hydrogen concentrations in the blood. So what that means, since we don't work with logarithms that often, if we were to have a pH of 2, which is about what gastric acid is, it's a very acidic acid or very acidic substance, that would mean, let's go ahead and do this. That would mean having a pH of 10 to the power of negative 2. That would be a negative logarithm, which is going to be 0.001 milliequivalents per liter of hydrogen ions. So that's a lot of hydrogen ions in solution. Remember, hydrogen ions are very, very minimal, but whatever minimal amount they have makes a profound impact on the acidity of a solution. If we were to have a pH of 4, then that would mean having a pH of 10 to the power of negative 4, or 0.00001 milliequivalents per liter. If we were to have 8, a pH of 8, that would mean a pH of 10 to the power of negative 8, which is 0.000000001 milliequivalents per liter. So the higher the pH goes, the smaller the concentration of hydrogen ions we have in that solution. And the lower the pH we go, the greater the concentration of hydrogen ions we have in that solution. And a hydrogen ion is also known as simply a proton. Either name can be used because it is simply a single proton and has a mass of 1 and a positive charge. And when an acid dissolves into a solution, they release their hydrogen ion or hydrogen ions and creates an acidic environment. So if we have a high pH, this means that the solution is alkaline or basic. And again, if it's a low pH, means that we have an acidic environment. So we have some of these. This PowerPoint presentation was not the one that helped me the most, and so I'm kind of working with it as best I can for myself. I think there are a few other things that I thought helped me understand better. So bear with me. So ABGs are very, very helpful. They're critical towards critical care patients. We're going to be looking at three different things with an ABG. We're going to look at the partial pressure of CO2, carbon dioxide. This right here is bicarbonate. This is a buffer, which we'll get to in a second. And we're going to be measuring the buffer, or bicarbonate, in the blood as well. And then we're also going to measure the pH of the blood, and we're going to use all three of those together to determine, is this patient experiencing acidemia or alkalemia, which acidemia and alkalemia are going to be the current state of a pathophysiologic imbalance in pH, whereas acidosis and alkalosis are going to be the actual process of something. So on a regular basis, at any given time, we may have an acidosis in a certain part of our body, an alkalosis in another part. They're so minimal and they're so well regulated by the buffer system that we never even notice it. They never even interact together. They're localized. It's not a big deal. The problem comes in when we have an alteration of the system that pretty much affects the entire body and is such an extreme imbalance that we have to have more dramatic compensatory mechanisms take place to try to control it. Okay, so we have, trying to figure out how best to explain this. So CO2, okay, I'm going to do this. So pH, as we saw normally, 7.35 to 7.45. PCO2, PaCO2, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, we are normally going to want to keep this at a range of, not that one, a range of 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. For bicarbonate, we're going to keep this at a range of 22 to 26, I think I have that right, bicarbonate, 20 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. These are our normal ranges that we want to keep everything in. If everything's in those ranges, then we're running a fine-tuned machine and we're good to go. But there are going to be times when that doesn't happen. For example, let's say a person's working out and it's a really strenuous workout. The body, when going through a strenuous workout, especially one that involves the anaerobic metabolism as opposed to the aerobic cellular metabolism, we're going to be developing a lot of lactic acid. This is normal. The body is prepared to handle it. But if we were not prepared to handle it, then what would happen is you just build up and build up this lactic acid, and you become more and more acidic over time as you're continuing to work out, and you would die. Because our body does not work well in an overly acidic environment, nor does it work well in an overly alkalotic environment. So the body is naturally going to do things to take care of that lactic acid buildup. For example, we're going to start breathing harder. We're breathing harder to try to lower the acidity of our body. And so that's where this respiratory system compensation comes in. And so we also have mechanisms for when perhaps there's something wrong with our lungs. Let's say a person's got COPD or CHF. They have an impairment to the gas exchange that can occur in their lungs, but we're still developing, and so we may be retaining CO2, and CO2 is also acidic. And so as we retain CO2, which is acidic, the body's got to find a different way to get rid of it than simply breathing it off, because clearly breathing it off isn't working. So that's where we get the renal system that comes in. And as we'll see, the renal system, this is going to get rid of CO2, not CO2, this is going to lower the pH. I'm screwing everyone up. This is going to fix the pH problem by dumping hydrogen ions into the urine to be excreted. It's also going to make more bicarbonate to help buffer and even out the pH in the body. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So bicarbonate, like I just said, is a buffer. A buffer is something that is going to kind of balance out pH in the body. It is itself also a base. Let's see here. So we've got parts of our bicarbonate buffer system here. We got our base, which is bicarbonate, HCO3 negative. We have carbonic acid, H2CO3, which is a weak acid. And at all times in the body, we need to keep this at a 20-to-1 ratio of bicarbonate ions to carbonic acid. That way we can ensure that we have a normal pH at any given time. So the bicarbonate buffer system works basically according to this equation right here. And this is a equality equation, is that what they call it? Basically, everything here is going to rock back and forth, kind of like a seesaw, based on whichever factors are different or out of place at any given time. So what we have here is we've got CO2, carbon dioxide, the stuff that we breathe out and is a byproduct of cellular metabolism, is going to combine with water to form carbonic acid. And carbonic acid's a very unstable substance or molecule. It does not like to stay in its form, especially because of the help of carbonic anhydrase, which is found throughout the entire body and can break apart carbonic acid into either direction here based on wherever the balance is. So then carbonic acid is going to dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, or HCO3. Whenever we have a acid-base imbalance, we can look at this equation and get a general idea of what's going on and what to expect. So, and I think I should probably go through a few more things first before going into that. Okay, so in general, so this, I don't fully understand, I don't know what the arrows here are meant to indicate. Maybe just how things go back and forth. I don't know. So the lungs and the kidneys are going to be the primary drivers that control acid base in the body. The lungs control acid base by either getting rid of or holding CO2. And remember, CO2 is an acid. So as CO2 goes up, that means, in our body, as we retain CO2, we're going to make our body more acidic, which means our pH is going to go down. H2O is just simply the partner that links up with CO2. It doesn't really have any other part to play in this. And so with the lungs, if we were to hold on to CO2, we would become more acidic. If we were to blow off CO2, we would become more alkalotic because we're getting rid of acid from our body. And then we've got our kidneys here, and our kidneys have a dual purpose. So first, they are actually able to themselves get rid of hydrogen ions in urine. So if we were to have a state of, let's say a person had pneumonia, they weren't breathing well through the lungs, they were retaining CO2, which is an acid, which means that our body is becoming more acidic. then what the kidneys are going to do is they're going to start by getting rid of hydrogen ion, because as we hold on to CO2, this is going to get more, this is going to build up more and more in the body. And as it does so, because this whole equation here, this guy right here, they're both the same thing, just in kind of a different view, is a teeter-totter. So as this builds up, it's going to spill to this side of the equality of this equation. It's going to be, these two are going to join up, form carbonic acid, which is going to rapidly dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, and it's going to push hydrogen ions to the kidneys to be excreted into urine. So we've gotten rid of part of the problem here through the kidneys. The kidneys also have a second duty in creating and reabsorbing bicarbonate. There's kind of this bicarbonate reserve in the kidneys. I believe they're in the kidneys. They could be somewhere else. But the kidneys help to form this bicarbonate reserve as well as reabsorb bicarbonate in the tubules. So that helps to get us some more bicarbonate, which is used as a buffer to help control the acid that's being built up by retaining CO2. Okay. Again, bear with me with all this stuff because this is, my brain doesn't link well that great with this PowerPoint. So with the respiratory contribution, the lungs are going to excrete carbonic acid, which is the broken down, or which is the combined version of CO2 and water. As we actually breathe it out, it's just going to be CO2 and some water. Some of that water that was formed into carbonic acid will actually just simply be reabsorbed back into the body to maintain hydration. And then we can change how much CO2 we give off by changing the rate and or the depth of respiration. And the thing that controls that rate and depth of respiration are chemoreceptors that are going to, I think they're in the hypothalamus? I can't remember exactly where they are. Maybe in the carotid bodies. And they're going to detect both PaCO2, the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, as well as the pH of the blood. And when they detect that there is a high level of CO2 or a high level, a low pH, an acidic pH, then it's going to signal the medulla. I'm really hoping I'm getting my brain parts not mixed up. To tell the lungs to breathe deeper and faster so that we can breathe off CO2 and make our blood less acidic. So like I said, we have some sort of carbonic acid accumulation or hydrogen ion accumulation or CO2 accumulation. And that's going to then promote an increase in the rate and depth of respiration. That way we can get rid of some of the CO2 or the hydrogen ion that forms into CO2, and we're hunky-dory. If perhaps there is, for whatever reason, not enough acid in our body, then it's going to tell our lungs, hey, kind of slow down on that breathing. Let's try to retain some acid, some CO2, so we can balance out this equation in our body. When the lungs are doing this to try to compensate for a problem, like let's say the lungs are not the reason for why this pH acid problem occurred, and instead it was a metabolic issue, then the lungs are going to compensate, but that compensation is a temporary measure. It's not something that is going to fix the problem. It's just simply a Band-Aid. The fix is to fix the original insult, the original reason for why that the body is either acidic or alkalotic. So what happens with CO2 and hyperventilation? We are going to blow the CO2 out of our body, and since CO2 is an acid, that means that our body is going to become less acidic, more alkalotic. So what happens with hypoventilation? CO2 is going to be retained in the body, and that CO2, because it's an acid, is going to make the body more acidic. We're going to be lowering the pH of the body. So when we read a CO2 level on an ABG, we are going to be using that to indicate what kind of efficiency the respiratory system is having in getting rid of acid, in getting rid of carbonic acid, though normally it's not measured as carbonic acid. It's going to be looking to see how well are the lungs functioning and doing their work. And so keep in mind also that the lungs only excrete carbon dioxide, which is broken down from carbonic acid. It does nothing to directly affect levels of lactic acid, acetoacetic acid, or keto acids. Those are metabolic acids rather than respiratory acids. Carbonic acid, you can consider that to be a respiratory acid. When these guys build up in the body, which creates an acidic environment, it's a balancing effect, and the lungs will kick in to try to get rid of carbonic acid so that the overall acid accumulation in the body is equalized. But again, that's a Band-Aid. That's a temporary solution. That's not going to do anything to fix the too much lactic acid or too much keto acid in the body. It's just to keep the person from dying short term. Okay, so I think most of those were already said. Compensates. Good. Okay. I think that was also already said. Yep. Okay. So renal contribution. So the kidneys are, and something else to make specific as well. The lungs work very, very, very quickly. They can adjust in a within moments of any imbalance occurring. The kidneys can contribute, but their contribution can take days to actually reach the point of making any profound impact on the imbalance. What they do is they excrete whatever acid they can from the body, but not carbonic acid, because carbonic acid is going to be that respiratory acid rather than a metabolic acid. And so they only excrete metabolic acids such as lactic acid, keto acids, all that, which are also continuously produced during normal metabolism. And then I forgot about this part here. So we also have the kidneys are capable of producing more ammonia, NH3, which can help to facilitate hydrogen ion excretion. Let's see here. Okay, I think that's all there is for ammonia. So yeah, the kidneys are going to help by getting rid of hydrogen ions with the assistance of ammonia. And then they're also going to help by, where is it? Well, they're going to reabsorb bicarbonate as well. Because bicarbonate, so we can detect the quality, how hard the kidneys are working, what they're doing by looking at bicarbonate levels in the blood, in that ABG. So when we look at a bicarbonate level in the ABG, that's going to reflect how much bicarbonate is being taken up at that time by any overload or underload of acids. So, because again, bicarbonate is a buffer. Go away. And again, bicarbonate only really is going to be working on metabolic acids. We can have a respiratory problem that leads to bicarbonate getting rid of metabolic acids, but again, that's a Band-Aid. That's not something that's going to fix the original insult of the problem. So if we have a low bicarbonate as measured via an ABG, that indicates that we have an excess of metabolic acids. So you can think as bicarbonate levels go down, the pH goes down, making it more acidic. And why that is because the bicarbonate is binding with metabolic acids to try to get rid of them. Okay, and then if we've got a high level of bicarbonate in the body, then that's going to indicate that we have a deficit of metabolic acids because there's nothing for the bicarbonate to really bind to try to control and buffer. So that means that we have an excess of base in the body. So we can think of it as if bicarb is going up, that means pH has gone up, which means that person is alkalotic. It gets more complicated than that, but we'll get into that. So if we've got an increase of acid in the body, that means that we are going to have the kidneys excrete more hydrogen ions into the urine. If we have not enough acid in the body, it's too low, and we're alkalotic, then we're going to decrease how much hydrogen ion is excreted into urine by the kidneys. But this takes several days for it to be really fully operative. The kidneys just take a bit of time to ramp up, to get going, and to really do their business. It's a slow process. Okay. So we have some specific acid-base imbalances that are important to be aware of. And like I said earlier, an acidosis is going to be simply that condition, that current process that's going on in the body. Whereas an acidemia is the actual state of having a pH under 7.35. And inversely, with alkalosis, it is the process of having something causing the getting rid of hydrogen ions, too much so, whereas alkalemia is going to be the actual state of having a pH above 7.45. So the four disorders that we have to be aware of, we can be either acidic or we can be alkalotic. And differentiating that further, we can have an acidosis that's caused from a respiratory problem, or we can have an acidosis that's caused by a metabolic problem. And logically speaking is you can go on to alkalosis, and you can have either a respiratory caused alkalosis or a metabolic caused alkalosis. And then there's the fun times where we can have sort of this combination of both an acid and a base problem, and it's all sorts of wonky. So some of the things that we can have cause respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis more likely is going to be the most common cause of, like the main cause of something in a patient of an acid-base imbalance, mostly because anytime you have a respiratory issue like COPD, CHF, pneumonia, pneumothorax, pneumonitis, all of these different things, an asthma attack, anything that is affecting the lungs like that can cause a profound and quick impact to the pH. And what's going to happen there is as the lungs are compromised, as the respiratory system is compromised, CO2 is going to build up in the body. As CO2 builds up in the body, that means the body is becoming more acidic because hydrogen ions are increasing in their concentration in the body. The pH is going to go down, making it more acidic. And we see lots of patients with respiratory problems. So they're all at risk of becoming of becoming acidemic. Am I saying that correctly now? Acidemic. Okay, yeah, acidemic. It could also come from neuromuscular dysfunction. So if a person's got muscular dystrophy, that could potentially cause a respiratory acidosis. Or perhaps there's a problem with the brainstem itself in controlling respiratory drive. I don't see it like this normally. This confuses me of bicarbonate to carbonic acid. But if you have a decrease, if instead of being 20 to 1 like it should be, there's now more carbonic acid, which means that it's perhaps 18 to 1 or a 15 to 1 ratio, then that means that we've got a acid problem. Specifically respiratory acidosis, because carbonic acid is supposed to be about respiratory stuff. Some of the clinical manifestations that we're going to have is a headache, tachycardia, cardiac dysrhythmias, because we're going to be potentially impacting things like potassium with this acidosis. An acidotic reaction is going to shuttle potassium out of the cells and into the main environment, making it so that the resting potential of cells is at a more hyperexcitable state. So that's why you're going to see things like peaked T waves with hyperkalemia and respiratory or any kind of an acidosis. We can see some neurological abnormalities like blurred vision, tremors, all that stuff. And if we enter severe respiratory acidosis, then we can get peripheral vasodilation with severe hypotension to the point of like shock. So when we look at an ABG with someone who has respiratory acidosis, we're going to see a heightened CO2 level, partial pressure of CO2, which means that, and most of the time it's 35 to 45, not 44, but each lab may be different. We're going to see a CO2 level above 45. We're going to see a pH that indicates acid or acidic. So we're going to see one that's below 7.35. And then at first, we're going to have a normal bicarbonate level because it takes a while. Bicarbonate, remember, is going to indicate the effort of the kidneys. And the kidneys take a little while to ramp up and actually get some sort of an impact made on acid-base balance. So at first, bicarbonate is going to be normal, so between 22 and 26. So what's going to happen with respiratory acidosis when it comes to compensating for it? The kidneys are going to start kicking in. It's going to take a couple days, but they're going to start kicking in to get bicarb bound to the extra acids floating around from holding on to CO2. They're going to excrete hydrogen ions through into the urine with some of that help from ammonia. And they're going to reabsorb bicarbonate so that they can continue having bicarb buffering the acids, the too many acids that are in the body. And that way we can try to sort of put a band-aid on this problem of something's funky going on with the lungs until we can fix the problem with the lungs. It requires several days to be effective, so you may not really show a fully compensated state until a few days later, but when you do see a compensated state, what you're going to see is CO2 is still going to be high because we haven't yet fixed the respiratory problem. We put a band-aid on it. So CO2 is still going to be high. pH may still be a little on the low side, or it may be completely normal. Keep in mind that when the body is trying to fix a pH problem, the body is not going to want to try to, because all of this takes energy. The body is not going to want to expel any extra energy than it has to keep this band-aid on this problem. So when we see, we have a normal range of 7.35 to 7.45 for our pH, and with our respiratory acidosis, we have something less than 7.35. So when the body's trying to fix this, the body is going to stop trying to go full force into fixing this once that pH reaches around 7.35. So it's not going to bump it up all the way to 7.4 or even further to 7.45. It's going to do the least amount of effort possible to make the body as close to balanced as it can so that it's not wasting resources. So if you're looking at an ABG, and we'll get to this in a bit, where it's like 7.35, but there are other measurements that are out of whack and you're not quite sure what that means for what caused the imbalance to begin with, you can always realize that if it's at this range, the lower end of normal, that means it was an acidemia in the first place. If it was 7.45, 7.44, and other things are out of whack, then you can realize, okay, that originally was an alkalosis issue. And then back onto this. So we're going to see, I'm going to kind of recap because I went on a tangent there. So we're going to see CO2 is going to be up because we have not yet fixed the respiratory problem. pH is going to be low or around normal on the lower end, depending on how much compensation has been achieved. Bicarbonate is going to be up. All right, just kind of confused myself there. So this whole thing is going to be screwy for everyone else. So the bicarb here also is up because the bicarb is trying to compensate for the acid in the body. So as bicarb goes up, that makes it more alkalotic. Because it's trying to pair up with all the acids to get rid of those acids from the body. So this is what it's going to look like when it's normal. Again, because I have to do that 3 times. CO2 is still up because that's out of whack. The lungs are a problem right now. We haven't fixed it. pH may still be down, maybe normal on the lower end, meaning that it's been acidic. And then HCO3 is going to be up as a compensatory mechanism to try to get rid of acid, and that's showing that the kidneys are actively trying to compensate for this respiratory problem. That was weird. All right, so now we're going on to metabolic acidosis. This is going to be where we have an excess of any acid except for CO2, carbonic acid. So lactic acid, ketoacidosis, all of those things would be metabolic acidosis. So this can come from either simply an increase in acid, or we may have an excess removal or decrease in base. So for some reason we've gotten rid of a whole bunch of bicarbonate and we're not sure why. Or it could be a combination of an increase in acid and a decrease in base. Okay. Most of the time that you're going to have this metabolic acidosis, the primary cause of it is going to be diabetic ketoacidosis, where a type 1 diabetic has not done a good job taking care of their insulin levels, or have gone cold turkey off of insulin, and the body is not able to utilize any of the sugar that they're bringing in through their diet, and so they have to resort to lipids instead for energy. So they break down fat, utilize that, but they create ketone bodies as a byproduct, which are very acidic, and it builds up, builds up, builds up. You're going to see patients with blood sugars in the 600s perhaps, or 400. They're going to have very fruity breath because ketones are very sweet smelling. Their urine is going to be very sweet smelling. and yeah, they're going to be very acidic. So some of the manifestations of this are going to be headache, abdominal pain, CNS, depression, confusion, lethargy, coma. Um, if it's gotten to the point where it's very severe, like a diabetic ketoacidosis, they're going to have tachycardia, going into dysrhythmias, um, potentially have a decrease in cardiac contractility, um, probably, I think, from the heart getting kind of worn out. And then eventually we'll have death from brainstem dysfunction if the pH reaches a point of below 6.9. Okay, so originally, when it is uncompensated, we're going to see a pH that is low. So we're going to see it below 7.35. CO2 is going to be normal because this isn't a respiratory problem. This is a metabolic problem. Now, keep in mind that with respiratory compensation, that occurs very, very quickly because the lungs can just easily switch on and off. The kidneys don't really do the same thing, but the lungs can. So only really early on, from my understanding, are you going to see a normal CO2 level, a completely uncompensated ABG with someone in metabolic acidosis, because the lungs are just going to kick in pretty dang early. And then you're going to see a decrease in bicarbonate, indicating that there is a renal problem, a metabolic problem going on with acid base. So what we're going to do to compensate for this is we're going to enter into hyperventilation. So we're going to kick the lungs into gear, blow off a whole bunch of CO2 to try to compensate for that buildup of lactic acid or ketone bodies, and try to get the pH back to a normal range. All of that stuff. Good, good. Again, we are not removing the metabolic acids. We are removing the respiratory acids just to try to get the body overall to be in a normal range. This is a Band-Aid. It is not meant to be a fix for what's going on, just to get things to the point of being acceptable. And according to this, there are other buffer systems. I'm not aware of what they are, but there are other buffer systems as well for metabolic acidosis that can play a part in maintaining pH. So it'll be compensated when we look at an ABG of metabolic acidosis. It'll be compensated when we see the pH has returned to normal. It'll be still on the lower end because, again, the body is not going to want to work any harder than it has to reach equilibrium or homeostasis. It'll be partially compensated if it's below 7.35. Bicarb is still going to be low because we're talking about a metabolic acidosis problem. But CO2 is going to be low because the patient's going to be having hyperventilation, trying to blow off all of that CO2 to compensate for the increase in metabolic acid. Okay, now moving on to alkalosis. I don't think respiratory alkalosis is very common. I think the main reason for why anyone experiences metabolic alkalosis is a panic attack. I believe that's the main reason. Maybe some alcohol withdrawal might be a reason for why that exists. But anyway, you're blowing off a whole bunch of CO2. For whatever reason, let's say you have a panic attack, you're blowing off CO2 because you're hyperventilating, and now you are not acidic enough. You are alkalotic. So what this is going to do is this is going to manifest as a increased neuromuscular excitability. So you're going to feel paresthesia in your fingers, around your mouth, We've all kind of felt this when, like as kids, we played around and tried to breathe as fast as we could, and we started feeling lightheaded. You started feeling kind of woozy. The fingers in your mouth started prickling around. That's the basic common manifestation of alkalosis. And of course, we're going to increase the pH of CSF, causing that confusion and some cerebral vasoconstriction, which is why we start to feel a little dizzy as well. Okay. And with alkalosis, remember, we're going to be shuttling the potassium into the cells, causing hypokalemia. So with that, we're going to see things like flat T waves or absent T waves, and potentially some dysrhythmias. So when we look at an ABG of someone with alkalosis, we're going to see a low CO2, respiratory alkalosis. We're going to see a low CO2, and that's the main problem here. We're going to see an increase in pH because we're alkalotic. We're blowing off all of our CO2, but we're going to have a normal bicarbonate level because the kidneys have yet to kick in. They're slow to kick in. That takes a little while, a few days. So that's what we're going to see early on. And then in order to compensate, we're going to have a decrease in kidney or renal excretion of hydrogen ions. We're going to try to retain them and reabsorb them as much as we can. The kidneys also are going to try to excrete bicarbonate to even further help in balancing out this pH issue. But again, this is going to take a few days, and it is not a permanent fix. It is a Band-Aid measure. So when we're compensated, we're going to be looking at PaCO2 being still low because that's the original issue. We're blowing off too much CO2 from, say, a panic attack. I mean, we're not going to have a panic attack over 2 days, so it doesn't exactly work out. But pretend we did. pH, realistically, when it's compensated, is going to be normal. It may be right at 7.45 because the body's not going to go into overdrive and overcorrect something. It's going to do just the bare minimum it has to, but it should be normal. And then bicarbonate will be low because we're trying to get rid of it. We're trying to compensate for this respiratory alkalosis by getting rid of bicarbonate. Metabolic alkalosis, I think the majority of the time that you see this is going to be profuse vomiting. Let's see here. Maybe steroid use, nasogastric suctioning, so loss of gastric acid, prolonged vomiting, thiazide diuretic use because of the impact of potassium, or overdose with bicarbonate, which is used during CPR. So sodium bicarbonate is given during CPR as to try to fix any, more than likely, acidosis, acidemia that might be going on from a person not breathing long enough. And if you overcorrect it, then you enter metabolic alkalosis. So some of the manifestations we're going to see is orthostatic hypotension, hypokalemia, because the potassium is going to go into the cells with alkalosis, which is going to make all the muscles kind of weak. And increased neuromuscular excitability, similar to when we are going into respiratory alkalosis. We're going to feel that, potentially feel, I don't know if we will feel paresthesia, but we're going to have neuropathy, tetany, seizures. And if it gets to the point where it's severe, then we're looking at confusion, lethargy, coma. And if we reach a point of 7.8 or above, then we're looking at death. When we look at an ABG, we're going to be seeing an uncompensated ABG of a high bicarbonate, because that's the problem here. pH is going to be high, because we're in alkalosis. And very early on, probably not for very long, we're going to have a PaCO2 that's normal because that's our compensatory mechanism. But that's going to kick in pretty quickly, and at that point, we're going to be seeing it going down because, I'm sorry, not going down. We're going to see this going up because we're going to stop breathing so fast. We're going to go into hypoventilation to try to compensate for this metabolic alkalosis. But unfortunately, we got to balance out our need for oxygen with our need to maintain a proper pH. So we may actually never really fully reach a normal pH with metabolic alkalosis. So we'll be kind of partially compensated. We could potentially reach it, but it may only be a minimum amount of time. So we're going to see bicarb is still going to be up, pH is still going to be up, or it may be normal, and then CO2 is going to be up to try to create an acidic environment. Okay, and here's a pretty good chart that helps to identify some of the interactions between things. So with our metabolic acidosis, this is going to be something like a lactic acidosis or ketoacidosis. Our pH is going to be down because the concentration of hydrogen ions is going to be up. So those are always inverse. Every one of these, it's inverse. The primary disturbance here is that we have those lactic acids or keto acids, and we're going to see it on ABG as being expressed via bicarbonate being down because it's binding with those acids. The secondary response is to decrease CO2, to blow it off, to get rid of it, to try to compensate. Because CO2 is an acid, we get rid of acid one way in our body, and it will help to kind of balance out the rest of it. Metabolic alkalosis, we have a high pH because we have a low level of hydrogen ion concentration. And the primary disturbance here is that we have an increase in bicarbonate in the body because there's no acid to really bind with the bicarbonate. And the body is going to compensate by retaining CO2 because CO2 is an acid, and that way we can kind of offset the acid imbalance, try to create it more acidic. With respiratory acidosis, we have a decrease in pH because there's an increase in hydrogen ions because we are not breathing well enough and retaining a whole bunch of CO2. That's the primary problem. We're going to respond to it by increasing our bicarbonate to pair up with the acids and get rid of them and put that Band-Aid on there and call it good. Respiratory alkalosis, we have a high pH because we don't have enough hydrogen ions in our blood. And this is because we're blowing off too much CO2, hyperventilating. And so we're going to respond by decreasing bicarbonate so that we don't get rid of hydrogen ions. We retain them and make sure our pH is balanced out. So we can also have mixed imbalances where two primary imbalances occur simultaneously. So if a person is hyperventilating and then they also start to have, let's say they're also going about profusely vomiting, then we are not only excreting CO2, which is going to make us more alkalotic from a respiratory standpoint, but we're profusely vomiting, which is going to lead then to metabolic alkalosis because we're getting rid of all that gastric acid, which has a huge amount of hydrogen ion, and we're going to have that double whammy going on there. And it's going to be difficult then for our body to really compensate for both of those at the same time. Okay. So I guess neonates often have mild metabolic acidosis because um, they don't have as easy of an ability to excrete large acid loads. The kidneys are less mature. They're not very mature, so they're less able to reabsorb bicarbonate, and they don't have as many buffers. So they normally are kind of just resting in a metabolic acidotic range. Then for geriatrics, they have an increased risk for respiratory acidosis because the entire respiratory system is less efficient. As you get older, things become stiff, you can't breathe in as easily, you can't expel as easily. And then the kidneys are less able to excrete large loads of acids. And they also are people who suffer from chronic laxative overuse, which means they are likely to experience chronic diarrhea, which is going to get rid of a lot of bicarbonate. So they're also at higher risk for metabolic acidosis. So with all of that said, there's some more stuff with oxygen transport, but I kind of wanted to go into here. This is ABG Ninja. It is phenomenal. It helps me a lot with really understanding what's going on with ABG and with acid base. I think this helped me more than anything else. So I'm going to run through a few of these. You just got to look up ABG Ninja on Google and you'll find this. So what we do is we have here our ABG. We got our pH, which, oh, you can't see that. We got our pH, which is normally 7.35 to 7.45. We have our PaCO2, which is normally 25 or 35 to 45. And then we have our bicarbonate concentration, which is normally 22 to 26. So we got our three measurements here, and we're going to use the stuff from the slide to figure out whether this person is acidic or alkalotic, and then is it a metabolic issue, is it a respiratory issue, and then do we have any level of compensation that the body is putting forth towards fixing this, or at least putting a Band-Aid on it, and then how compensated is this problem. So first we've got a pH of 7.42. So 7.42 falls perfectly within 7.35 to 7.45. So we know that this is a normal pH. So it's a normal pH, but they wouldn't be here if there wasn't a problem. So we're going to look at CO2. CO2 is 25, and normally CO2 should be between 35 and 45. So given that it's 25, and we know that CO2 is acidic, which means anything above 45 makes a person more acidic, and anything under 35 makes a person more alkalotic, that means that this is an alkalotic problem here at CO2. We don't know whether maybe that was a compensation issue or if that was the original insult. We kind of have to go on to bicarb and look at what bicarb is showing us to determine whether or not, to determine which one is the culprit. So bicarb is 16, and bicarb normally is at 22 to 26. So bicarb is kind of inverse in how it's measured compared to CO2. So when we're looking at bicarb, a number above 26 means that it is more alkalotic. If we're looking at a number below 22, that means it is more acidic. So this, I can't write here, shoot. Let's see if I can do this. Can I write? Hey, I can write, sweet. So we know that 7.42 is normal. And then 25 is going to be low for PCO2, which means that is alkalotic. And we see that bicarb is at 16, and 16 is low, which means it is acidic. So what we've got here is, it's hard to figure out which one of these is the original culprit, because clearly right now one of them is the culprit behind the original acid-base imbalance, whereas the other one is the compensatory mechanism to try to fix the imbalance, and it's fixed it to the point where the pH has actually been able to return to normal. So the way we figure this out is we look at the pH, and we can see the pH is more towards the higher end. We're not looking at one that's strict like 7.4. This is more, a little bit more towards the alkaline side, which means that we want to look at which one of these two, which of these guys here is more alkalotic. Whichever one is more alkalotic will identify then the culprit behind making this alkalotic. And then the other one that is acidic is the one that helped bring it back to a normal range. So we've got our pH of 7.42. Oh, let me bring that back up. So we have alkalotic is 25, that's our CO2. So more than likely, our CO2 respiratory is what caused our alkalosis. So we choose respiratory, alkalosis, and then we go over to compensation, and we figure out, is there some level of compensation? We can see that there is, because both of these are outside the range of normal. So we have a metabolic because the compensation, the CO2, alkalotic CO2 was the original insult, and this refers to the lungs. We then see that bicarb, 16, is also out of whack. It's out of the normal range, and this represents metabolic efforts. So we have a metabolic acidosis as our compensatory mechanism. And we look here now towards level of compensation, and we can see this is within normal ranges. If this was outside normal ranges, it would be partial. But because this is within normal range, we're going to say it's full, and then hit submit, and there we go. All three are green, which means we are what's this? Let's see here. From a technical standpoint, we call respiratory alkalosis the primary cause in this quiz, but in real-world practice, the metabolic acidosis would be the true culprit. Well, they're going above my head, but whatever. Let's try another one with perhaps a little less talky-talky. Okay, so we've got a pH of 7.48. That's too high. So being that it's high on a pH range, that means it is alkalotic. So we know it's going to be acidic. Don't know whether it's metabolic or respiratory. We'll get to that. CO2 is 38, which means it is in the range of 35 to 45. So we know it's not respiratory because this is normal. So now we go on to bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is 27. So 27 is outside the range of 22 to 26. And we know that with bicarbonate, the higher you go, the more acidic it is. The lower you go, no, the higher you go, the more alkalotic it is. I made a mistake here. The higher you go, the more alkalotic it is. The lower you go, the more acidic it is. And this is alkalotic, this is not acidic. So we know that it is acidic based on this, and we know it is alkalotic. Did I say acidic again? This is alkalotic. This is alkalotic, which means it is a metabolic alkalosis. Now we got to figure out what level of compensation do we have going on. CO2 is at 38, which is in between 35 and 45, which means it is not compensating. It would be compensating if it was outside the range of 35 to 45. So we can say here there is no level of compensation, or no compensation, which means innately there is no level of compensation. So we have, everything was correct. It was a metabolic alkalosis with no level of compensation. All right, so now we have 7.39. This is a normal pH. It is maybe a little bit towards the acidic side because it is under 7.4. Because it's so close to normal, I kind of have to let it err towards that side. Actually, so it's 7.39, which means it is normal. CO2 is between 35 and 45. It's 39, so it's normal. Bicarb is 23, which means it is it's normal at being between 23 and 26. So this person doesn't have a problem. So there's no primary problem. There's no compensation because there's nothing to compensate for, none. Submit. So they are normal and healthy. They are within normal limits. Okay, there are some extreme numbers here. So we got 7.21, which means this person is acidic. They are below 7.35, which means they are acidic. CO2 is low, which means alkalotic. So this number represents an alkalotic number. So that doesn't pair up with pH being acidic. This is acidic, this is alkalotic, so this has got to be a compensatory mechanism. So I'm going to confirm by going down to bicarb, and looking at bicarb is below 22, well below 22. So being that it's below 22, that means it is acidic, because as we know, similar to pH, as you go up in pH, it becomes more basic. As you go up in bicarb, it becomes more basic. As you go lower on both of those, it becomes more acidic. And then it's the inverse for CO2. So what we have here is a metabolic acidosis because bicarb has to do with the kidneys, which is metabolic. CO2 has to do with the lungs, which means respiratory. Now, is there any level of compensation going on? We can tell there is some level of compensation because respiratory, CO2, is not within normal range. So the 21 is well below 35, so there is some level of compensation, which means we do have, and it's below 35, which means it is alkalotic. So we have some level of respiratory alkalosis going on to compensate for the metabolic acidosis. It is not a full compensation though, because we are still under the normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. So we're not going to pick full, we're going to pick partial compensation. So this is a metabolic acidosis because we have our kidney problem. Bicarbonate is low, which means acidic. And it's low, bicarb is low because it is binding so much with all the other acids. So this is low, and pH is low, being that it's acidic, so we know it's a metabolic acidosis. We have our 21 for PCO2, indicating we are compensating with a respiratory alkalosis because this is alkalotic, and it's only partial because it is a 7.27. It has not re-entered a normal range yet. And we are good there. All right, going to bounce back to here. All right, so I was not used to that doing that. Okay, so we've got our oxygen transport. This is a long PowerPoint. So red blood cell production requires iron, B12, and folate. We have our hemoglobin, which is the protein inside the red blood cell. It's going to be all of these doohickeys. No, those are oxygen bounded. Okay. No, those are. Okay. So we've got right here our hemoglobin molecules are going to be all of these little guys, which have heme groups inside. There are 4 heme groups and 4 O2 molecules per hemoglobin. I think that's what it was. I may be wrong on that. That's okay. Yeah, so all this carries O2 and carries CO2, depending on which direction is going, and we got the chemicals we need and the chemical waste we can get rid of. So gas exchange, so we breathe in oxygen, binds to hemoglobin in the red blood cells, give it to our tissues. Now we take up our carbon dioxide, carry it off, and so we can breathe it out. Okay. So if we notice that, or if our body has a decrease in red blood cells, we're going to express that in the body as having a lower level of O2 delivery to the tissues. That's going to include a decreased lower or a lower O2 level delivered to the kidneys and certain sensor cells within the kidneys. When those cells detect that there is too low of a level of O2 in the body, they're going to increase the secretion of erythropoietin, which is going to then signal the bone marrow to produce and release more erythrocytes so that we can ensure we have enough cells capable of carrying O2 and CO2. So yeah, that's that. And then we can have anemia if we do not have enough red blood cell production. Like let's say there's a tumor in the bone marrow of the bone. Then we may have a decreased red cell mass production. We still may have enough erythropoietin going in and signaling the bone marrow, but because of that tumor, there's a decreased production of red blood cell mass. And then we can have polycythemia if maybe that tumor, instead of reducing, I don't know whether the tumor would work, I'm just creating that as an option. Cancer is easy to blame for all sorts of things. Maybe the tumor instead is overabundantly creating red blood cells and the erythropoietin from the kidney is actually decreased, but it's still this constant production of red blood cells because of that tumor. So we get polycythemia. Okay, so anemia is going to be the deficit of red blood cells, meaning that we don't have enough red blood cells to carry oxygen, we have decreased oxygen, and we have poor perfusion of oxygen to the blood or the tissues. We can have either relative or dilutional anemia, or we can have absolute anemia. The difference here is that we have a normal red blood cell total in relative anemia, but the plasma volume has increased, so it's kind of just diluting the red blood cell concentration, kind of like a hypotonic solution. Absolute anemia is where it becomes a real problem, and that's where we actually have a measurable decrease in the number of red blood cells. So with our absolute anemia, we can have 3 different types. We can have a decrease in red blood cell production, maybe there's a tumor, or we can have an inherited disorder of red blood cells, like maybe sickle cell anemia, or we can have an extrinsic red blood cell destruction or loss, like having someone stab you with a bull, or I guess the bull would stab you with their horn. you've been gored and you lost blood. I got to come up with some better examples. So clinical manifestations is going to be related to the idea that we have lost oxygen. We're going to become hypoxic. So early on, we're going to compensate for that because we still have a decent bit of blood left, or a decent bit of red blood cells left, depending on which type of anemia we're talking about. Eventually, though, we're going to start having fatigue, weakness, dyspnea, tachycardia, pallor, because we're not getting enough O2 to the tissues. And we need O2 for cellular metabolism, which is how we get energy. Eventually, we're going to begin experiencing hypotension, maybe syncope, passing out, tinnitus, intermittent claudication. I just forgot what that was. I'm okay with that. And then eventually angina, because the heart eventually is going to suffer from a lack of O2. And we're going to, I have no idea what that says. Oh, there we go. We're going to test for anemia by doing complete blood cell counts. And I guess there's a difference. I don't remember there being a difference between male and female, but I think that makes sense that there's a difference between male and female counts. I don't know. That's not what I just recently researched. So we're going to do like a red blood cell count, hemoglobin, hematocrit, MVC. There are a couple other things. Excuse me. Okay, so yeah, that's it. Sorry for the super long PowerPoint.